Hello, and welcome to our Language, Culture, and Intervention Learning Community. This is part one of our three-part series, and we'll look at how we can adapt culture to encourage healing and behavioral wellness. My name is Megan Ray, and I'm a TTA coordinator for SAMHSA's Tribal TTA Center. On behalf of the Center's Contracting Officer Representative, Maureen Madison, and Alternate Contracting Officer Representative, Jan Dunbar-Cooper, as well as our project co-directors, Lori King and Gloria Guillory, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. In a few minutes, we'll start our presentation in a good way. But first, I'd like to take a moment to review our process. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a replay will be available in the near future. Because we are recording, all phone lines will be muted to minimize outside noise, but please don't hesitate to use the chat box for questions throughout the session. Today's PowerPoint is available for download on the lower right side of the screen. Just click left on the File and Download File button will appear at the bottom of the box. Clicking that button will start the download. Finally, we appreciate you completing the brief participant survey you'll receive. This helps us better tailor the event to your needs. Opening in a good way for us today is our colleague, Mr. Zach Hartliff. Zach?
Thank you, Megan. Hello to everyone, wherever you may be. Good day, good afternoon, good morning to all who are listening out there. And I was passed some virtual tobacco and humbly accepted to open this up in a good way today. So with that, I'm going to use Ojibwe language, and following that, I'll do my best to give a brief explanation of what I was trying to get across. Agetchigishe manadu, Mishomasug, Nukomasug, Atsu Kanak. I go adapin wa all, Nam Eo, Nungum. Migrich Mishyang, Kakina Bimazian Nungum. Dagaganawena Mission Nam, Kakina Wea, and Niki. Anoki niniwag kay anoki koywag ejutagayang gaya nishnave auditorium kaya join mishnam gakina nishnabeg presendawi omanungum. So just a brief explanation. I said our creator, grandmothers, grandfathers, and all those kind spirits that are helping accept this prayer today, and give thanks for this life and for all the gifts that we receive. I ask that everyone who has come together to do this work is blessed as we continue to work towards our old traditional ways, and I ask for special blessings to everyone listening. Thank you all for listening. I hope. Back to you, Megan.
Thank you, Zach. Hello, everybody. My name is Megan Ray, and I'm Pomo and Wailaki, and I'm one of our TTA coordinators with our SAMHSA Tribal TTA Center. Really excited to be able to be with you guys today and to help present this part one of our series. We're going to be discussing a couple of different interventions that are out there that are working in our tribal communities, and I'm really excited to see the balance of our traditional and ways of doing things mixed with some modern technology and some new advanced ways of thinking. So thank you everyone for being with us. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Mr. Josh Schuler.
Hey, Megan. So thanks to everyone out there. My name is Josh Schuyler. I'm a member of the Oglala Nation, currently residing in Metro Detroit. So I'm an urban Indian. I've been working in communities across Indian country for the last 8 years plus. Definitely honored to be here with you guys today, presenting and co-facilitating along with Megan, and want to move on to get into some of our intentions for the webinar this afternoon. So our intentions are to explore American, Indian, Alaskan Native communities have adapted for effective behavioral health programming, discussing challenges of adapting evidence-based interventions in communities, and then have a panel discussion format that will allow the attendees the opportunity to ask questions and share approaches that have worked in their communities. So moving forward. All right, at this time, I'm going to push it over to Eva. Eva has worked a lot with digital storytelling, and we'll start off with an example of what she has done over the past several years in Indian country. So at this time, we're gonna show a quick video.
I arrived on April 19th, 1947, at the Eastern Doorway. I grew up near the village of Custer, Michigan. At 6 years old, I remember sitting on the floor next to my mother's feet in a circle of chairs with only an oil lamp flickering, and hearing my mom's voice shaken from pain. I saw tears streaming down her face. I didn't know why she was crying. She would share stories with her female relatives around the talking circle. She said after her mother died, she was taken away from her father and her brother and forced to live in boarding schools. She was punished if she spoke her language. Her hair was cut, and she had little to eat. When she cried, I would just cling to her pants. As a small child, I felt her pain and her hurt. I attended public schools to fit in with the Western ways, but instead I felt isolated, discriminated against for being an Indian, and was called names. I quit school in 11th grade. I went on with life in my native community and got married and had kids. After about 15 years, it became harder to support our family because we couldn't hunt on our lands anymore. Gathering materials to make baskets or canned berries or other foods, we had to leave our community to survive. My husband and I moved to Wisconsin. He worked in the auto industry while I stayed home. It was difficult living in the mainstream world. It took a beating in our relationship in more ways than one. Finally, under protective custody, I picked up my 2 kids and left back to Michigan, never to return. In my 30s, my addiction started. My anger was malicious, and I was spiritually bankrupt. After 9 years of self-destruction, jail time, and my daughter having to raise my son, the courts gave me a choice: go to treatment or go to jail. 3 months later, I found myself in a talking circle with 20 strangers. One by one, they told their stories. My heart pounded fast and hard out of fear. I wanted to stay, but another part of me wanted to run. As the eagle feather came closer, I was so scared. I spoke my pain, and my tears came like rushing water from an open dam. In that moment, I began my journey back to my people. I had the courage to look within myself and at the truth. I realized that my mom's story had become my story. Martha Case Dishnakas, Dodam Mukwa, Dunjaba Pentwater. I am Ottawa Kwa and a substance abuse counselor working with several Native communities, and I help people reconnect to their spiritual self.
Hello, everybody. Bonjour. Ozal Shashko Gijugo Kwai and Dishnikas, Nagisi and Dodam, Nade and Dam. I spoke my Anishinaabe name first, just so that I can come to you this afternoon with in a good way and with humility and with the help of my ancestors. So. Listen to Martha's story. I love the way that she ended it. with a statement about reconnecting to our spiritual self. And that's really one of the most important aspects of healing in Indian country, and that is reconnecting to our spiritual self. And stories tell us how to do that. And stories are one of the best tools we have to help us do that. And we discovered that, and I guess I've discovered that throughout my life, but we certainly have discovered it in our work within our Anishinaabe Healing Circle, Access to Recovery, as well as in earlier work I've been involved in going back into the late 1970s, where we have used indigenous stories and indigenous teachings to be part of both healing and wellness in indigenous communities, and doing that in schools, doing that in community settings, doing that in families. So stories are very important, and the reason that they're important is they're alive. And I know many of you know this from your life experiences, that our indigenous stories are part of what connects us to our creation stories within our culture. In the case of Anishinaabe people, which I am Anishinaabe, that connects us to not only our creation, but also our migration stories. They tell us about where we come from, how we came to be where we are, what brought us here. And well, in the process of listening to those stories and then also of telling them, they have a life. The stories have a life. And so that in our traditional teachings, in our Anishinaabe way, when we go and listen to our traditional stories, our stories of creation, our stories of migration, that the spirits we talk about within those stories are present. And I think that's true also when you think about the stories we've made. You just saw one of them, Martha's story. Her spirit comes through, and the spirit of her ancestors, her mother that she speaks about, and her other relatives, her children. So stories are very much alive, and that's why they're so powerful. Stories use our breath to share what's in our heart, our mind, and our spirit. And in our Anishinaabe way, and I know in all of the other tribal communities across the country and across the indigenous communities across the world, they also tell us about our relationships to the animals, to the plants. There are so many examples of stories that do that type of teaching, our connectedness to the creation. Stories are used to teach about, as I said, I guess, where we come from and how to live a good life. Another project that I've been involved with back in the 70s into the 80s and 90s was a project that's known as the Red Cliff Wellness Curriculum. Some of you may have heard of it or are familiar with it. And in that curriculum, it's a school-based curriculum that's been used across Indian country quite a bit. We took indigenous teachings that emphasize certain values. In our case, it was around the 7 grandfather teachings of respect, love, truth, bravery, wisdom, generosity, and humility. And we found stories within our communities that could illustrate those values. So we have a collection of, in that case, with that project, because of the technology, we were just using written stories, and then we'd have elders come into the school or community and tell the story. That was the preferable way, but also using a written form. But now we're working on a project of digitizing those stories too, at least the ones that are available to be told in a digital format. So that's really an awesome use of technology, and the story can go out to a larger audience. And of course, there's protocol about when stories can be told, but that can all be part of the instructions on using that type of media within your communities. So the other thing that stories can do, they can be used to share life's lessons and pass on teachings from one generation to another. And most of the stories that we've done through the Anishinaabe Healing Circle, of which Full Circle and Martha Case's story is one, they are really in the category of stories that share life lessons. We started a project called Sowing the Seeds of Recovery. And we started out initially with a group of actually mostly women that came forward, women in recovery and Native women in recovery within Michigan, Anishinaabe women. And we grew that process out, and now we have told over 80 stories similar to what Martha's story that has been shared. And what we realized in that process is that the stories are telling your story in a digital format, and it takes a while. If you think about the content of that story, it's a reflective process. You have to write a script. You have to find photos of your family to go with it. You then have to work the technology and then use your own first-person voice to tell your story, and then splice all of that technology together to make it come together. It's quite a process. But in the process, you also use extensively story circles and talking circles to kind of bring the story out, to bring it out from what is often, in many cases, some parts of these stories have just been untold. So it's bringing out some of our untold challenges, our untold successes, our untold accomplishments, and demonstrating our resilience as Anishinaabe and as Indigenous people. All of the stories we've made have been told in the first person, and it's a much different process than just sitting someone down in front of a camera and having them talk. It's a thoughtful, reflective process that really brings the story to life. Again, brings the story to life. And it's very healing for the storyteller, and it's also very healing for the listeners. We've done 80 of these, as I said. We started out with a group of people in recovery, and then we've expanded it to a much larger group, so we have stories from people of all age ranges, from young people to elders. The two that we're going to show today are stories that were done by elders. But you can see all of this, well, some of the stories. I think there's only about 22 of them on our website, the atrhealingcircle.com. If you go there and click on Sowing the Seeds of Recovery on one of the tabs, there are, I think, 22 stories there. So if you're interested in looking at more of these, you can go there. And we will be taking questions at the end, but I think we're going to show another one of our digital stories now. So.
I was born to John Kajate and Frida Cobb on August 19, 1952 in Muskegon. I was their pride and joy. At 9 months old, my dad died from appendicitis. My young grieving mom took me to live with my grandmother in Peshabi Town as she continued drinking alcohol to numb her loss. I felt loved and happy with my grandmother in our Odawa community. Braiding my hair, she would say, "Go to school and be proud you are Indian. It cannot be taken away from you." In school, I loved reading and always read above my grade level. Being the only Indian in my class, I was called names and felt discriminated against. Eventually, my mother married a white man who was physically abusive. At 7, I helped raise my sister and 2 younger brothers. When the drinking and fighting began, I would take my siblings down the railroad tracks at night to my grandmother's, our safe haven. At the age of 10, we were taken away permanently because of the alcohol and abuse. My sister and I were placed with Vernon and Joyce Brandt. Then I was moved to a Catholic orphanage because of my baptism. I used to get up at 5 a.m. with the nuns to attend Mass and pray every day. For 5 years, I was moved around, from orphanage to foster home to a locked Catholic school, then back to my original foster home. I set a precedent for Catholic children to be placed in non-Catholic homes. It felt like nobody wanted me and I didn't fit in. Nevertheless, I continued to excel in my classes and prayed daily. In 1970, I graduated from high school with honors, and I was accepted at Michigan State University. 2 years later, I dropped out and moved to Bashabitown. During this time, I left Catholicism and began looking for my traditional spirituality. All my life, I always knew I was Indian, and I needed to go home. Within the first few years, through ceremony, I got my Indian name, Bimosadnawa Inkwe, middle way woman. It means I have lived in two worlds, Indian and white. I know how to help our people go back and forth. And also, I am middle way between the spirit and physical world. My name helped me understand my childhood struggles and my purpose. Today, I continue to attend ceremonies, offer tobacco at sunrise every morning, and dance at our powwows. In 1982, the Creator guided me to my adopted parents, Hilda and Jerome Surratt, who are my primary traditional teachers. My dreams guided me to be initiated into the Medewan, and for the first time in my life, I knew where I belonged, and that it could never be taken away from me. I remember one dream where I was walking through a glass corridor covered with a teepee that connected two buildings of a college. The dream guided me to continue learning not only our traditional ways, but to continue learning in the educational system. Afterwards, I went back to school to finish college. In 1995, I received my bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in Indian studies. And in December 2011, I received my master's degree in educational administration. Bimosadnawa Inkwe Indijnakas. With the Creator's help, I am ready to help my people. We need to walk in both worlds to succeed. We need you as an Indian person to obtain an education and for you to learn and remember our traditional teachings.
We're going to continue on with our next presenter. I'm very excited to be able to introduce Mr. Willie Wolf. He comes from the Red Road Leadership Consulting. He is Cheyenne River Sioux, and he is also one of the leading trainers that we have here in Indian Country. So please, Mr. Wolf, take it away.
Good morning and good afternoon to all my brothers and sisters. I extend a warm handshake to each and every one of you. And you're the most important people on this call, and we really appreciate all the hard work that you're all doing. And I want to thank my sister Eva for her wonderful presentation. Storytelling is such an important part of our culture, and that's the theme of this webinar today, and that's how we share our culture going down from one generation to the other. And I want to start off today by just saying in our language we could say, Iche Wichasha, I'm a common man. I've been following the Red Road for 35 years. I don't have all the answers, but one of my spiritual mentors used to always say, the more you seek, the more you find. So I'm still seeking. And I'd like to start with this quote from one of our spiritual leaders who passed on a few years ago. He's from the Oglala Nation at Pine Ridge, as you might know it. He's one of his famous quotes is, the two biggest problems in Indian country are alcohol and jealousy. Now, you could take out alcohol and put in any drug that you want, and that'll still apply there. And then the jealousy part refers to the cultural oppression and colonization that we've been dealing with over the last 500 plus years. So I want to briefly talk about that. That's a very, very big topic, as many of you know, but I want to talk about what happened when our culture was not respected in the early encounters with my good friend Harold Belmont, who passed on a few years ago and was one of the leaders in the early stages of Gona. Used to call them the intruders, not the Europeans. I always liked that term that he used. And I'd like to start off by going over some of these things here. I didn't put everything here, but I think these are some of the major things that happened in terms of trying to destroy our culture, really our cultural genocide, as some referred to it. There's a book out there called Healing Our Soul Wound by Dr. Eduardo Duran, and that's one of the best source books I could recommend to you that describes the historical trauma our people have gone through. And I'm just focusing on a few things that relate to the breakdown of the culture that I think are really important to be aware of. And we're still dealing with this today. You know, a lot of times people say, oh, why do you have to go way back? Well, the reason is, as we go through this, hopefully you'll see why it's still something that affects every aspect of our lives and our communities. It affects the individuals, affects our families, affects our organizations, and it definitely affects our communities. So there was a whole process of cultural genocide that happened early on from the first encounters back in the 1500s. And one of the things that Europeans saw as a threat to their way of life was our spirituality. And some of our leaders at the time, towards the end of the 1800s, said we could have survived everything. The Indian Wars, the introduction of the many diseases which wiped out so many of our people, the boarding school, all of it, the loss of our land. But the one thing that hurt us the most was the loss of our spirituality, is what they said. And I didn't really know until I started doing my research on this the extent to which the government went through to try to take that away from our people. And some of you may know about this, but for example, in South Dakota, and this happened throughout the country, I'm just using this as one example, in a place outside of Sioux Falls, which is the largest city in South Dakota, about 30 miles from there, there's a small community called Canton. And back at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, they rounded up our spiritual leader, our medicine men, and they incarcerated them in this, like a mental health facility there. And they went, the conditions there were abhorrent, as you can imagine. They were basically, they were held captive there. And there was a writer from the New York Times that found out about this and went there and wrote about it, and then within a year they had closed it down. But that's how threatened they were. And of course, they outlawed many of our ceremonies, whether it was the Sundance ceremony or the pipe ceremony or the potlatch ceremony here in the Northwest, throughout the country. And of course, we weren't allowed to even use some of our very traditional things, such as the eagle feather. So those are all ways that they were trying to take away our spirituality. Then, of course, we saw the loss of language, and some that was completely wiped out with some tribes. Others are on the verge of losing their language. Been a lot of efforts to revitalize that, and a lot of communities have very, very strong language programs now, so that's a good thing. Our traditional values, there's many of them that are out there, but there was an attempt through the acculturation, assimilation process to distort those. For instance, traditionally we emphasize cooperation over competition, and for some people that's been turned around. I'm just using that as one example. In terms of breaking down the family structure, we saw the boarding school, and Dr. Maria Braveheart, one leading experts on historical trauma, has said that based on her research, the source of all our dysfunctional behavior comes from the boarding school experience. And once again, this is an attempt to take away our culture. Of course, you know about the famous quote that William Pratt, who came up with the first large boarding school at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, his famous saying was, kill the Indian, save the man. So when they say kill the Indian, they didn't mean literally kill us. They meant take away our culture. Although a lot of people did die in the early days because of the conditions at the boarding school. And then on top of that, we had children that were placed in non-Indian foster care and adopted out. We're not talking about a few. It was the highest percentage of any ethnic group in the country, and that continues today, even though the Indian Child Welfare Act has helped make a difference in terms of keeping our families together. And then, of course, you know, some of the rites of passage, which is an important part of our culture for all our tribes, were taken away from us. A lot of people don't follow those, but that is starting to come back now. And then our family systems, which are very, very strong, going back before contact with what I refer to as the intruders. And our extended family, we call it Tioshbae. Every tribe has a different name for that, but it goes way beyond what traditional extended families are. And so we had a really strong support system, and that was really broken down again as another way to negatively impact our culture and way of life. So from there, then we see some of the post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. I'm not going to go over all these with you, but I just listed a few on here. The one I will point out that relates to the culture here, you see down there, cultural self-hate. So when people don't speak their language, you start to see people start saying things like, well, that means I'm not Indian. And, of course, that's not true at all. Or people don't know their ceremonies. So once again, it's like you're not Indian enough. And so people start turning on themselves. And this isn't the only factor, of course, but it's one of the reasons that our suicide rates are so high. So that's why that's a significant issue. And I don't get you too depressed, so I better keep moving on here. We'll get to the good stuff, so hang in there. There's what we call the cultural framework in terms of looking at programs that help address these issues, whether it's in prevention, intervention, recovery, or treatment. It's important to take a look at how important culture is. And, of course, Eva was talking about the Red Cliff Prevention Curriculum, and that's what we call an evidence-based program based upon scientific research. And there's a pretty drawn-out process for how you get there. And that was the first, for a long time, that was the only one in the country that was culturally specific, an evidence-based program. There's a few others. I'm going to mention one here on this, a couple slides coming up here. But these are some of the reasons that it's hard for the dominant society to understand how important culture is to our people. Within the framework of science, what can be observed is what is counted. However, within the context of the Indian way, not only is there the seen world, but the unseen world as well. You know, and we always talk about that other world, the spirit world, and so, you know, it's hard to quantify that sometimes. That's why, you know, there's a lot of the misunderstandings that occur. Native American community teachings provide the basis for understanding what works and why, and these teachings are accessed by the elders who have been the basis for healthy communities for many centuries. And the reason that we have so much of our culture today is because our elders, they kept the songs, the traditions, the customs, even in spite of all the terrible things they had to endure. And experts in Native American communities are often elders, carry spiritual, cultural, and intellectual wisdom of the community. I certainly agree with that, but it's also important to remember, because some people haven't begun their healing journey that are elders, wisdom and age are not always directly linked. So, and some of our young people are wise beyond their years. So you know, have to keep that in mind too. And you know, the beautiful thing is more and more of our young people are growing up with the culture from the time they come out of the womb. You know, they learn the songs early, they learn how to dance, they learn all the rites of passage and go through them, and they grow up to be really, you know, very, very strong spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically. It's important to note that while Native American communities have different definitions, different cultural values, we're just interested in providing programs that work and are based upon sound principles, laws, and values. So we believe that it's important to show that, you know, we want cultural programs that work. I'm going to share with you some of those in just on the next slide here. So what I just shared with you comes from something that was done from an organization that I'm sure some of you are familiar with called White Bison from Colorado Springs, Colorado. And it was called Developing Culturally Based Promising Practices for Native American Communities. So even though we only have a few programs that are evidence-based, we have a number that are what we call promising practices. And they all have these elements and much, much more in terms of depicting the strength of our culture. And I want to mention a few of these here. One is White Bison, as I mentioned. They wrote a book. The people at White Bison, Don Coyce is the president, and a number of other people, as they put together stories of recovery, and it's called The Red Road to Albrighty. They have a number of different programs in the areas of prevention, intervention, recovery, and treatment that have been around since the 1990s. And I don't work with them as much as I used to, but I'm a big supporter of some of the things that they have developed and implemented, and they've helped a lot of people along the way in those 4 different areas that I mentioned. And culture is a big piece of all their programs. And the one thing I like about them is that they make it so that you can adapt the culture in your area. You know, if you're Dene or you're up here, you're with the Salish tribe, or you're from the Northeast, or any of the tribes up there, wherever you happen to be from, you can take your values, your rites of passage, and plug it into the programs that they offer and adapt it. So that's one thing they encourage you to do, which I think is really awesome. Another one that's out there is been around for quite a while. Is was developed around the same time as White Bison back in the mid-1980s. It's called the Red Road Approach for Prevention and Treatment, and that was developed by Gene Thenelk and Rick Thomas, who are both Lakota and Dakota. And this is more culturally based than some of the others. It's heavy emphasis on the Lakota and Dakota traditional ways, but they also, it's something that you can adapt for other tribes as well. But there are a number of programs in the Plains areas, particularly in Dakotas, that use that. And we're working with the treatment center up at my home reservation, Cheyenne River, and they've been using the Red Road approach for a number of years now, and it's been very, very, very effective. And I'll talk about some of the ceremonies and that are in there, but that they utilize on the next slide here. Of course, gathering Native Americans, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with that. SAMHSA has been using that. The Technical Assistance Center has that as one of their primary prevention programs, and some communities use it more than once a year. They do it, some even more than that, 2 to 3 times a year. And it's been used for alcohol, all drugs, and historical, has different elements to it. It addresses some of the historical trauma issues that I touched upon earlier, and it's been very, very, very effective in helping communities to get a sense of what some of their their needs are, and then from there they go into different areas they want to focus on relating to prevention and treatment issues. The last one I have up here is I have one from the up here in the Northwest, Healing of the Canoe. I put that on there because that's just recently been awarded evidence-based program, and in conjunction with the University of Washington. But it's based upon the teachings of the canoe journey, which was something that was brought back in 1989 to the tribes here in the Northwest. And they have these 10 laws of the canoe journey, which if you're interested, you can go to their website and just put in Healing the Canoe, and you'll see a lot of information on that. But it's one of the things that I thought was very interesting with that is they have these different modules regarding the teachings you learn when you participate in the healing of the canoe journey, and it's really like become a rite of passage in itself for a lot of the youth. And they have, like I was saying, one of their modules is focuses on the opiate addiction. So they're always updating it and making it as relevant as possible to whatever the issues are that they're currently dealing with. So let me keep going here. I want to talk a little bit about cultural protocols. I think in terms of one of the first things you want to do is identify culturally competent staff, and this includes volunteers, if you're going to use them to help you with conducting ceremonies or rituals, whether it's a prevention program, treatment, and if you're not sure where to start with that, ask some of the people that are respected in your community, some of your spiritual leaders in the community, people who've been, really involved in it. And it's like everything else, you got to make sure you have the right people, because if you don't, it can definitely cause more harm than good. And I think most of you probably know that. But, if you do your homework, your due diligence, you'll find the right people. And it makes all the difference in the world. Then the next thing I have up there is follow tribal or local cultural protocols. And you just have to find out what those are wherever you are. And once again, it's just about asking people, and they'll let you know. I just used this one example about the talking circle, because there's different ways of conducting that. And so you need to ask people, for instance, when you have the circle, do you go to the left or do you go to the right? That may seem like a small thing, but if you're in a community where they're used to doing it one way and you go the wrong way, then they kind of look at you like, why didn't you ask us what the right way was before you started? So, and I must confess, early on when I was doing this a lot, we had a certain way we did it, and I'd go other places and they did another way, and then they tell me afterwards that's not the way we did it. So I learned, but you don't have to learn trial by error. That's why we're sharing this information with you. So you'll just ask the right people and then be prepared when you go in there. I have on here, respect those who may not be open to some rituals. And I'll give an example, like we go around and we smudge. A lot of times people do that in their programs, like early in the morning, start the day off right, or throughout the day. If you're having a hard time, people do that to purify themselves and to help them deal with, maybe they're having a tough time that day, whatever it may be. But if you're like in a circle, sometimes people use the smudging before the talking circle begins. So you go around and you give everyone an opportunity to smudge. So rather than just automatically smudging somebody, you want to either ask them or wait for some sign that they're okay with it. Because some people, I'll just use this as one example, may not like sage, for example, because they're dealing with, it reminds them of marijuana, and they're recovering from that. And so they're not allergic to it, but it's kind of like a trigger for them in some ways. So I'm just using that as one example. So we have to, be aware of this. And then some people, that's not their way. And so if that's not, that's okay. We don't, force our culture, our values on other people. We just say, this is, how we're going to do it. And if that's not your way, that's fine. Same thing with the eagle feather. We use that a lot of times in all our ceremonies. Some people may not be okay with that. You can just pass it on to the next person, and they'll let you know if they want you to do that. And so, anyhow, those are a few things on that. I said have fluent speakers on staff. This is, I think, very, if you have a number of people that speak the language in your community, it's really important to have at least one person. If you're a larger tribe, to have, several on your staff that are fluent in the language. And sometimes you can have people from the same tribe, but you have different dialects. Like we have 3 dialects in our tribe. We have Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. So there are some differences there. So you have to be, aware of some of these things. And within every tribe, I know that is true as well. Adhere to traditional values. And so this is an important part. We have, like in our tribe, what we call the 7 laws. And some of the values are kind of universal, like respect and generosity. I think every tribe considers those 2 in particular to every tribe I've ever worked with. Those are values that they relate to. Some of the others you can, change around. But find out what those are, and then, you can, integrate those into the program. And then I have on here, the last thing is cultural humility. And so it's like sometimes we joke around with this a lot, but it's important to respect other people's culture, other tribes. Like, I'll just give you an example, and I'm sure all of you have your own, but sometimes I say we might say something like, there's only 2 kinds of people in the world, people from Cheyenne River and people who wish they were from Cheyenne River. So I just say that as a joke. I don't really believe that. That's a form of what the anthropologists called ethnocentrism, fancy word for it. But for us, it's just our version of teasing. Okay? So when in reality, what I believe is mitake oyasin, we're all related. And so if you really understand the deep meaning of that, then, everybody has their own beautiful ways, their own traditions, and so we should, respect all of those. And the other thing I think in terms of cultural humility is that it's an approach that's interactive, and you approach it with the person with openness to learn. That's very, very important, because we don't have all the answers. We approach another person with openness, and we ask questions rather than make assumptions. And we always strive to understand rather than to inform others of this is the way it is kind of attitude. So those are some things I wanted to share with you on culture.
Thank you so much. We have several questions for you and for Eva, and so I just wanted to pass it to Josh, and I'll let him start off. Thank you so much, Willie. That was really great. And those slides, there was so much information on those, and there are a lot of good things that we as our team were talking about. So I'm excited for those to be out. So if you didn't see, there is a PowerPoint that is available for you to download. You just click on that and highlight it and then download that file for that. So Josh?
All right, thanks, Megan. If anybody else has any questions, any participants, feel free to use our chat box as well. We'll be monitoring that throughout this question and comment portion. But for Eva, going back to her presentation, how do you approach someone about using a digital format for telling their story? Do they come to you? Or if they're hesitant, how do you encourage them to use a digital storytelling format?
Well, we named our initiative Sowing the Seeds of Recovery because what we found happened, we started out with just a few people doing their own stories here in Michigan, and it kind of grew on its own. So people, for example, I was in one of the first groups of people that made my own story, and we had about 5 people. And then we shared those stories with some of our other collaborators across the state, some of our family members, our relatives, our friends, and then people would come forward and say, oh, I want to make a story, and no, I have a story to tell. And so, like I said, we've told about 80 of these recovery stories, but beyond that, other people came forward and wanted to tell a story about some other kind of obstacle that they overcame in their life. For instance, we had people tell stories about smoking cessation, about dealing with cancer. So a lot of people just came forward. It kind of grew its own. I think we have recruited, though. I mean, sometimes we've put out something in a community and said, we're going to be doing digital storytelling. Are you interested? But mostly it's been word of mouth. But if you wanted to do a formal recruitment process, that does work. I mean, we have done that in some locations, and people come forward. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that doing a story in a digital story is the way we've done it is we've created a very safe and sacred space for people to share in, because I think people are often hesitant. Well, they're either gung-ho or sometimes they're hesitant to tell their story. And there is a readiness aspect to this, and you really don't want to push people forward when they're not ready. Because some of the things that people have brought forward through story in our communities here have been some pretty deep stuff, but beautifully done. And the resilience of our Anishinaabe or of our indigenous people just shines through in these stories. But they're not always story, some of them are intense. We've had people come in and do stories on recovery from sexual assault and sexual abuse. And the question is always asked, do people need to share their stories? And the answer is no. The story belongs to the storyteller, and so the storyteller has the ability to decide what happens to the story. In the case of the ones we have on our website, the people have just said, and the one I showed and the 2 that we tried to show, they have said, well, just show it everywhere. It's out there for the public. And a lot of people will do that, and some aren't ready to do that. But generally, I'd say most of the stories we've made, I think we've only had 2 or 3 where people felt like they weren't ready to share their story, and that's okay. They can show it to their family members. Maybe they just show it to one other person. So, and yes, we have trained people in our community in addition to so the way that we do it, everyone makes their own story with a lot of support and help, especially elders or people who are not familiar with technology. Young people who are, or I shouldn't say necessarily young, but people who are familiar with technology, because we've had a few really techno-savvy elders too, but people have participate directly in the technology. So people who are making their own story are learning how to do this. And some people are more interested in that aspect than others, but we've had a lot of people who are very interested in that. So we now have we have our own homegrown story, digital story, makers who can go out and facilitate a process like this. And I would encourage communities that are considering this to do that, because there's some people in your community, no doubt, who are really just made for this kind of thing, waiting for it to come along. So you have to have good facilitation skills, or some combination of a team that somebody has good facilitation skills and somebody has some real interest in technology.
All right. Thanks, Eva. Yeah, you answered my next question. I was going to ask about the building capacity in the communities. You know, coming in and having the interventions, one part, but also having the training and using some of the skills and some of the resources that are already available in our communities to help bring these digital stories to life on both ends of the camera. So thanks for your input. I'll pass it over to Megan. I think we have a couple questions for both Willie and Eva.
Yes, thank you, Josh. Folks wanted to know a little bit about how to kind of navigate implementing grant funding when there's an evidence-based requirement, and like what are some tips or different ways that they can try and really stay grounded and not so much trying to fit to that specific grant requirement.
Go ahead, Willie. I have a lot to say about this, but I'm going to hold.
Oh, all right. Well, I'll just start it off, I guess. I think how hard and fast is the requirement for evidence-based? That's obviously something you have to find out. For instance, I went over one that was evidence-based, but then all the others were what we would call promising practice. And so if they're okay with that, then you can use a promising, that's not hard to find. There's a number of promising practice that are culturally specific programs that are out there. So, you know, you just have one from your area, your tribe, or if there's one that you want to adapt, you can certainly do that. So, but go ahead. Sounds like you got a lot more you want to share.
I'd like to say that I worked on preparing an application for the NREPP process. And now I know NREPP, maybe some people don't know, National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, which is something that SAMHSA has. Apparently that is going to go away, or maybe it already has. And SAMHSA is moving in another direction with that. But I did prepare an application for that, the Red Cliff Wellness Curriculum. But in the process of doing that, we debated whether to go forward and prepare that for probably 5 years. And in the debate is really important, because I think it's great. I know that people have to be responsive to whatever requirements are written into proposals. But I think we also don't want to lose sight of advocacy in this area, because there are places around the country, I think it's in Oregon, and also we've made some progress here in Michigan, advocating to have our own panels to identify and determine what type of evidence do we want to consider when we are looking at a program. How well does it meet the needs of the community? How well is it matched to the local culture of the community? So I think there are a lot of different types of evidence, and the evidence that has typically been applied to these types of requirements, the quasi-experimental design that's required for the NREPP process, is based on a Western scientific model, and that's a useful inquiry. But it's not the only way of knowing. And I think, Willie, you touched on this also, that some of the best practices that have emerged out of Indian country have come from a different place, a different way of knowing. And I don't think we should allow ourselves to be oppressed by the Western scientific method. I think we can use it, but we don't want to be oppressed by it. So I don't know who's listening out there, but certainly if any of you are young people with your life ahead of you, take that on, because it's an unresolved issue. And I just think it's one that if we could continue to validate our own worldview within our own way of knowing, within our own epistemology, if you will, and that is the way in which people know what they know. And the Western world, the world is filled with scientific inquiry, and it's a good thing, but it isn't the only way to know something. And it sometimes oppresses other ways of knowing. And so that's why I take that up every opportunity I have to say that. So, but in terms of grant writing, if you're going to use a best practice or an evidence-based practice, you know, you always have to justify what you're doing in that context. And if you want to get the grant points, you'll have to do it. It probably isn't the best place to make the argument that I just made, because that probably won't get you points. But there are other forums for that.
Awesome. Thank you, Eva. That was excellent. I just wanted to, because I know there's a couple of different questions I wanted to get to them. So another one is wondering kind of, this is for both of you, what are some of your hopes and visions as it relates to kind of Indian country and developing or renewing or creating, you know, interventions? You know, what are some of your ideas around that?
Well, let me share a couple things we're working on. One thing is kind of another part of digital storytelling that we did a reflective study, kind of a qualitative look at the feedback we received from people who have made a story. And one of the things, the concepts that emerged from that process is the idea of forgiveness. And while I think that is critically important, and Will, you did a great job of covering in some detail examples of and the issues surrounding historical trauma and intergenerational trauma and the impact on our mental health and on our overall health. And I think those issues are important to continue to educate ourselves about, because we forget that new generations come up and sometimes they're not educated about this. And it's very important to continue that education. But it's also, I think, important to explore opportunities for people to experience some deep level of, and I don't have a better word for it. In English, the best word we could find is forgiveness. But I think if you look in each indigenous culture, there is a word that is well, it comes down to, like in ours, it's minobematsu, and it's to live in balance. But it's kind of going back to restoring that balance. So we're working on ideas. We found that digital storytelling brings about forgiveness. And we're actually doing a study to look at that. So I think trying to find ways to enhance our resilience, our protective factors, that's what I would say. I really hope that we move in that direction in Indian country. I think you started out really talking about jealousy. Alcohol and drugs and jealousy is one of those things that we need to really work on, and restoring ourselves to health in a place where we can move forward in a good way in our relationships within our communities, so that people are not discouraged, but that we encourage young people through role modeling our ability to walk in a good way with one another. So any kind of program that helps to build up those really positive values in our community and restore those where they've been lost is something I really hope we can find people motivated to do that and take the leadership on them in the future.
So in terms of intervention, I don't know, it's been a few years now, but with the Red Road approach I was talking about, Gene Tenock and Rick Thomas were the ones who developed it, and then we had a request up in our area, I won't say which tribe, but most tribes have struggled with this issue. Is they're having an epidemic, suicide epidemic in the community, and they were at a loss as to how to deal with it. So Gene got about 10 of us together, all Native American healers who follow the Red Road, and we went in there for a week. And it's basically an intervention. And so we did some of the more traditional things that you would do, like, we did the research to find out what the problem was and looked at some of the data. And then we met with people at the schools and people in the community. But the cultural piece was we went into the homes where the suicides were committed, and we did ceremonies there, and we blessed the people, and we sang songs. And then, that was really, really an important part of it. And then at night, all of us that were healers, we went to the NREPP, the sweat lodge, every night together because we had to take care of ourselves, because it's really intense work when you're doing that, because you get up when the sun comes up and you're working until like midnight every night for 7 days a week. It's not like an 8 to 5 kind of thing. And anyhow, after we finished, and we did some presentations in the community as well. We had one-on-one sessions. My wife's a storyteller, so she used that skill, and so we each had our different ways of helping the people. And they set up a task force when we left, and they got some additional funding from IHS to deal with it. And then they'd had, the year before we were there, as a community of about 3,000. They had 13 completed suicides and well over 100 attempted. So, and, so anyhow, I was able to go there and follow up with them about 6 months later, but the year after we were there, they didn't have a single suicide. So I don't attribute that solely to what we did, but I do believe we made a difference. And, that's an example of how powerful our beautiful ways are and how they can help heal the individuals, the families, and the entire community.
Thank you, Willie. This is Eva. I just wanted to add a little bit to you. You reminded me something I wanted to say when I was thinking about this presentation, that here in Michigan we have done, and I'm sure many of you out in the audience have done this also, where we have, some of the tribes, not everyone, has integrated traditional healing into their health clinic or into their behavioral health center, so that if someone is coming in for health concerns, or in our case, what we've worked with is through our Anishinaabe Healing Circle initiative is people coming in for depression or for substance abuse issues. They're able to see if they desire, they're able to see the traditional healer, and so that then a ceremony can be done to help with that, and with whatever they come in for, and different types of ceremonies that are for different types of things. And also people can, if they haven't, like in our way, if you need an Anishinaabe name, or if that's desirable from the person on their recovery road and they don't have one, they can get one, and they can learn about other fasting or other practices, or participate in those things when they come around different times of the year, participate in various ceremonies, so that making that available to people when they're coming in, and what you just described is making it available in general in the community, have people come in and help when there's a crisis, but also on an individual level when people are in crisis with a health care issue, or with a mental health issue, or a substance abuse issue, that making those options available to people. And through our project through SAMHSA, we were able to also make those billable services, and we had to make it seamless so that we weren't asking traditional healers to fill out forms or things that were intrusive, but there are ways to do that too. So I just encourage that integration within your tribal systems or within your clinics and your prevention programs, because some of those ceremonies are very good prevention, in prevention as well as in intervention. So I'll just add that.
I'll just give you one more example in terms of intervention. And one time, I wasn't there, but I know this happened. There's a person that he'd been in 5 treatment centers for alcohol, and you know, that's not an unusual story. As we know, many of our people go through multiple treatments, and part of that, there's a lot of reasons for that, but a lot of times because there's not adequate aftercare in our communities. But at any rate, he'd never really been involved in a culture before, and so they invited him. One of our spiritual leaders, that are really, really gifted and very powerful, invited him to come to a sweat. But he spent a lot of time talking about him. This is really key, talking to him about making a commitment before he goes into the sweat, which people who really understand how it works, they know how important that part of it is. And so, you know, it had to be clean and sober, you know, at least a week before he came in there. And then he talked about other things he had to do to get himself ready before he came there. So he did all those things, and then he came there. And after that sweat, that was, well, it's been 20 years now. That was the last time he ever drank. And he did other things to work on his healing after that, but he said that was the intervention that really made the difference. Now, I'm not going to say that's going to happen to everyone that goes through that. You have to be ready, and everything has to kind of line up, and you have to have the right person that's there to guide you through your healing journey. But it can happen. I've heard many stories like this before, and so I had that experience from being around it in those kind of settings. So anyhow, there's you know, our cultures are very, very, very powerful, and if we use them the right way, they can definitely transform people's lives.
All right, thanks, Willie and Eva. Another question we have for communities, so just to kind of lay some framework here, is communities sometimes get funding, and you guys have done a good job so far of kind of explaining some of the process, but we're looking at, like, what are some suggestions, best practices, and lessons learned to help communities that stay grounded in the culture. And you guys both shared a couple of stories that reflected that, and not so much try to fit into a small box or try to fit into the grant requirements. Can you guys share any information you have on that for the people listening?
Well, I think even with grants, you have to kind of walk your talk. I'll just say that, so that when we submit a grant application, we do we do a ceremony in preparation, maybe not right when we submit it, but as we're working on it. And what we always ask for is, this might sound strange because it's a competitive, and you touched on this again, Willie, it's a competitive world out there, but what we always offer a prayer for is for those resources to go where they're needed the most. And if that's us, well, then that's good. And if it's not, good for someone else. And that's a good way to start out. And then also asking for help in going forward in a good way with your grants, because grants are grants are tricky. I've done a grant. Right now my current job, I've been a grant administrator for the Access to Recovery Initiative here in Michigan for 12 years, and I can tell you it's well, a lot of you, I'm kind of preaching to the choir maybe if there's probably grant administrators out there, but it's tough, but you have to work closely with the community, so you have got to get good advisors who can give you good advice from the community perspective on what's needed, and working from the grassroots up rather than the other way down. And your role as a grant administrator is to, I think in Indian country, is to kind of be that that go-between, or that, as Arlene said, walking in two worlds. You have to kind of get between what SAMHSA or some other agency wants and what the community, what you know, or what the community is telling you that they need, and find some creative ways to make that work. And the answer is not always that you have to read what the requirements say and do everything they tell you, because you can act as an advocate to, and a lot of times the funding agency offered reasonable solutions to making the project work from a Native perspective. Will go along with it. I've found that over and over again. So anyway, some of it's advocacy. It's a lot of listening. It's more important as an administrator and a leader in Indian country, or as a, I guess, I don't know if leader is the word I want to use, but it's always important to remember that you have two ears and one mouth. It's really important to remember that. And it's a good thing if you can learn to really enjoy listening to people. I feel like over the years I've really come to, if I could just have a job where all I did is listen to people, I never had to say anything, I would have a great time, because people have great ideas. Anyway, that's what I'll share.
Yeah, I would just echo what Eva said in regards to that part about listening. And to me, that's the first part of the grant process, is helping the community find their vision. And in order to do that, because you can have a grant writer come in and write the most beautiful grant you've ever seen in your life, you know, but if they haven't been in touch with the people and asked them what they want, then I've gone into communities where that's happened. People have written an incredible grant. The community doesn't even know anything about it. It gets funded, and then it never goes anywhere. I mean, it just falls on its face, because if you don't have them engaged and they don't support it, then it doesn't matter. So you've got to listen to the people, and you go in there and you follow cultural protocols. You know, and make sure there's food there. You know, you have, you know, lighten it up so it's not all serious business, even though you're probably doing a serious topic, and make it a fun kind of experience. And then, you know, make people comfortable, and then they'll share their concerns and their issues, and then from there you can do everything else: the goals, the objectives, the work plan, the evaluation. That'll all flow once you have the vision. It all starts with that.
All right. Thank you both for your comments and responses. I think we have about 8 or so minutes here, and I'll pass it over to Megan to ask one of our final questions before we start to wrap up.
All right. Thank you, Josh. The last thing that we really wanted to kind of touch on is in terms of evaluation, do you have any thoughts on how community can develop a community-drive evaluation process to help empower their cultural-based interventions, and what would that process maybe look like?
Well, this is Eva. To me, the ideal process is some of what we both described earlier, that in our last comment, that I'll give you an example. When we worked on the Red Cliff Wellness Curriculum, we just gathered a group of people together who were concerned about healing and recovery in our communities, and people in recovery for the most part, a lot of people that were there, and some young people. And we just asked ourselves the question: what do people need to be able to do, and what do they need to know, and what do they need to be able to do to live a good life, and to keep them from falling into, you know, addiction or sorrow and these things that bring us to tragic outcomes. And we spent initially we spent 3 days in a combination of ceremony and talking about that question. And we mostly told stories. People mostly told their own stories, or stories of other, or teachings that they had, and we went on and on and on until we had this great big gathering of ideas. And then we came together again over 3 times, and eventually we brought those collective ideas forward into what then became that initiative. I think that process isn't used enough, and I think we need to begin to name it something. It's an indigenous model for well, I guess GONA does some of that, but if we're thinking about evaluation, I think that process of community engagement at a deep level about bringing out the vision for healing in a community in our own words and in our own ideas and in our own way is really important as a foundation to both developing an initiative but also to doing evaluation, because it's hard to develop. I did evaluation for years too, so I have this sort of left brain part of me that can kick in and talk about that stuff. But the difference between me and other evaluators is that isn't my core belief. It's just a useful tool in navigating the system. But talking about evaluation, so if you have a vision, then you can begin to look at what are your outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and you begin from there to talk about that. And one of the really innovative things that we did around this issue is I had to always do logic models for projects I worked on, and I found that no matter what I did, people didn't like those. I mean, most people. I mean, I'm kind of nerdy, so I don't mind doing that, but I think for the most part, it didn't resonate with people. And so one of the things we did is we created a digital logic model, and it was awesome. It's awesome. It's an awesome tool. So there's a lot of ways to think outside of the box, and that digital story tells every single thing that a left brain boxed out logic model that you might have to develop to begin your evaluation process would do, but it tells it in the form of a story.
Would like to ask any last-minute questions?
I just want to encourage you all to use your creativity and do it with a good heart, and you'll be successful in your efforts to incorporate our really amazing indigenous ways into our continued healing in our communities, because it's the reason that we're here. It's the assembled prayers and ceremonies of our ancestors, our grandmothers, our grandfathers. It's the reason that we're here. It's very powerful. Miigwech.
Thank you, Eva.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Willie.
Oh, just to say that do everything you can to include culture in your, whether it's prevention, intervention, recovery, or treatment program, and you don't want it to just be an add-on. Make sure it's a major part of what you're doing, and you will see that the beauty of our culture will really enhance all of your efforts and help you to have a far more successful program. And that's what I wanted to end with.
Awesome. Thank you, Willie, and thank you, Eva, so much for being with us today and for sharing such amazing tips and skills and stories and wise words and teachings, and there was just so much that was all wrapped up in today's presentation. So thank you, guys.